Welcome everyone to Talawa Justice Talks, a discussion forum where we talk about justice for victims, reparation, and women. We have a very special guest today, my fellow Jamaican, someone who I respect tremendously. She is Joyce Hewitt, the Chief Executive Officer of Woman Inc., one of the foremost gender justice organizations in Jamaica. Woman Inc. is a voluntary, nonprofit, non-governmental organization which operates in the Caribbean island of Jamaica. It was founded in 1984 and is one of those organizations that I think most Jamaicans know as, the premier organization that assists women who are victims of human trafficking, sexual harassment, rape, incest, domestic violence, and other forms of gender-based violence. And I know Joyce would probably hurry to correct me to say we don't only assist women, because I know that they assist men also. Women Inc. operate the Crisis Center, which provides professional and specialized advice and outreach support to women and men that have or are experiencing rape, incest, domestic violence, and domestic crisis. Joyce, thank you very much for joining us.
I thank you for the opportunity.
Your organization, Woman Inc., has been leading the fight against family, gender-based violence, and human trafficking in Jamaica for over 2 decades. Tell us, Joyce, what are some of the most difficult challenges that you've seen in this area?
Well, I would certainly say one of the key challenges, if you will, is attitudes. The attitudes of the average person, the average man on the street, the average woman on the street, and from the lowest levels up to the highest levels, including the attitude of many people who might sit on the court, for example. And the set of attitudes that prevail generally is such that it is not nothing, So what she complain about, if it's domestic violence, for example, if it is domestic violence and it has spilled out from the home, which normally it doesn't, but in many cases it goes out and into what we would say, refer to as going into the street. And everybody will then say, or the many people will say, oh, well, why she stay with him then? Well, she must like it, or she must have a reason for staying with him. So that it's always, the attitude is such that it's responsibility of the woman. And even more so in the instance of rape. Why she go there? Well, why she walk that way? Well, she must have known don't go. Why is she out with him at 11 o'clock at night? All of the reasons that are given come from what we have as a set of attitudes that are such that it puts the blame on the woman. It puts the responsibility on the woman, and it leaves no room at all for looking at the man. And that is why many times Woman Inc. will bring in the men, because we're trying to change the attitudes that prevail. It has always been since 1984, and it is today in 2021, a set of attitudes. When we have the instance to go before the Joint Select Committee of Parliament, when we're discussing laws and trying to get greater protection for women and young girls often, we're then confronted with, again, the attitude that prevails that is from the people who are in control of our laws. Mm-hmm. And it takes an awful lot of energy. It takes an awful lot of patience. It takes so much out of those of us who are in this game for the long time to change the attitudes. I constantly say that until we change the attitudes, we will not change the behavior.
That's it's a very powerful statement, Joyce, because you are saying that these attitudes, these negative attitudes and perceptions, which are impacting behavior, are, you know, the man on the street and the parliamentarian, you know, it's so irrespective of the level of education, the societal standing, there are a number of negative attitudes which impact the way women are perceived, and then, of course, inform some of the behavior that you are seeing that is contributing to the violence against women. Now, what do you do? What does Woman Inc. do to actually try to address some of these attitudes that you're speaking about?
Well, primarily, some of the work that we do comes under our public education.
Mm-hmm.
And in the public education forum, which we launched in 1989, so even that goes back quite a long way. But while we don't say it aloud in terms of saying this is the attitude, but what we will do, we promote a various set of a pattern of behavior that we have people enact. Like we will do a lot of role play, or we will ask the participants in a workshop or in a seminar, even when we go to schools where we're dealing with younger persons, is that we will have them enact a particular, we'll just give them a scene and say, you enact it. And then based upon that, we then lead the discussion so that persons will begin to see alternatives to what they're thinking and what they're saying. It's a long, long haul, but we do know in the areas where we have been able to really get in, like with the police, for example, we do start to see a set of a change, but the overriding problem is that it's not enough. For example, we might get out 3, 4, 5, 6 times during the course of a year. And then what's happening to the rest of society where we're not reaching, where maybe there's 1 or 2 other organizations like ours who may be doing the same similar kind of thing, but we're not reaching the bulk of the population. So that until we get to really be able to engender and continually, it needs to be something that is a continuous and sustained effort. And for our organization, we simply don't have enough to do that. And also the fact that we go out when we're invited. We don't go to a school, for example, without an invitation. We don't go to the teachers' union without an invitation. So that it's never a position that's saying, oh, look what we have for you. You know, we've got all the answers. Because of course we don't. But the fact that we then as an organization rely upon persons being aware, persons being sufficiently interested, and for whatever it is during that time of the year or the day, is that that also is a priority. Because while in many cases you will have people who express an interest, but especially now with COVID, there's so many other priorities. So there's so many moving parts, and it's just not enough. We had a program with the police whereby we trained maybe in domestic violence intervention about 700, 800 police over the course of a year. But then the police force is numbering 10,000, 12,000. So then you can get an understanding of how much more needs to be done. And if I had my druthers, that's where we would just be there ongoing on a daily basis, on a monthly basis, and really, really digging in, because they too, the police and the soldiers, are among both the perpetrators of violence in many ways, especially with domestic violence and intimate partner violence.
Right. And that's interesting in terms of the target group for some of your training and your focus in trying to change some of the behavior. And Joyce, I want to open this out a little more because, a lot of the audience for Talawa Justice Talks is an international audience that might not be familiar with the specifics of the Jamaican context. But from what I'm hearing and based on my own experience in other contexts, even in post-conflict countries where, for example, these are countries ravaged by war, and they're trying to rebuild their justice framework or just rebuild their structure. And I know that some of what you are talking about is what we would refer to as the context in peacetime. That is, Jamaica is not engaged in any war, any kind of major war. But yet you have such high numbers of gender-based violence, as you say, and intimate partner violence. What do you think are some of the factors driving that in a country where, in relative terms, you would say it's not a major conflict zone as we would describe it for some of the countries that we work on, Syria, Libya, and other countries where it's a conflict zone? What are the factors that are driving some of these acts of violence that you're seeing?
Well, it's a combination of things. Number one, Jamaica in and of itself has this, what I would consider to be the underbelly of the society, whereby, again, the attitudes are a major factor, but also the level of crime in general is very, very high as compared to many of the other countries of similar size. Even if you look at Africa, even if you look across other parts of the environment as such. And then you have the historical aspects of it, whereby, for years on, it was okay because women were considered chattel. And we've not totally grown out of that. Women who are considered second, never first, never equal to. Women who are subjected as a matter of not only ownership, but objectivity. She's there as an object. She's there as a means for just your sexual gratification. Mm-hmm. She has no value. We have yet to come to a level where we begin to see women with value or mm-hmm. even equal value. The religious mores still very much a part of the society, an ingrained part of the society. And the fact that many times you will hear and you will actually experience pushback from the religious section when you try to talk about women's rights and equality for women under the law. They will always constantly push back to say something like, whatever part of the Bible keeps the women as chattel, keeps the women as possession, keeps the women as second class, rather than seeing her as equal. They will never refer to the parts of the Bible, in fact, that do, in fact, elevate women and elevate women in terms of value. So that's a major component too. It's also a part of the culture itself. And we're just coming out of, there is movement whereby the acceptance of what's the dance hall came out as dance hall music, but it was all too often denigrating and really putting women down, talking about the worst aspects of women and relationships of women in ways that for a long time, even the women were at these venues and soaking it all in and dancing to it. Now, again, we are seeing movement in that regard for the cultural aspects, but there's still too much that is permeating the society and keeping women at a distance in terms of just being seen as valuable.
Mm-hmm. That's an important point, Joyce. And it's good to hear you talk about a turning of the tide, at least in relation to the popular culture, because I think that is something that is possible, and that would resonate even beyond Jamaica. That even though traditional patriarchal structures and cultural perceptions about the place of women and that keep women subjugated, you're saying that those things can actually change. And this is one of the
Yes.
things that I would like to hear from you in terms of anything else that you've seen as a sort of positive evolution regarding the perception about women, regarding even the fight against violence against women that you've seen in 24 years of Woman Inc.'s operation.
Well, I would say most of the positive evolution has been in recent times. And I think a lot of that has to do with maybe other parts of the world. And the fact that when you hear from other parts of the world, I often say not only television, of course, which has made the world much smaller, but nowadays everything is so instant. And when we see the instant parts of the communication networks, such as everything and his brother, that I call it, on the internet, when we take the positive aspects and are influenced by the positive aspects, we are beginning to see, and a major part of that too is the involvement of men, in that you do have, I would say maybe a low level, but a small groundswell of men who are becoming more keenly aware, maybe because many of them have daughters, maybe because many of them have recognized the value of their sisters, of their mothers, and the other women in their lives. Maybe she's just somebody down the street who's a neighbor who's hardly known. Maybe she's the matriarch for the community, someone who persons do listen to. So we're seeing that positive move. We need, of course, many, many more, but we are in fact seeing that men are more involved. Even here in Jamaica, we have a couple of men's groups that have now actually structured their own mission around helping the society move towards recognition of women and treating women with respect rather than seeing her as second class. So that is a positive thing, and I think that that will continue to grow. And that is the major part of the evolution that I would say is taking place right now in Jamaica.
No, that's great to hear. And I think this is, again, something that we can transpose then to other contexts as well. I think the important role that men can play in moving the issue of violence against women forward and bringing a change. I remember speaking with a colleague who is also a woman leader of a survivor organization in Uganda. And she talked about some of the challenges that they were facing with COVID-19 and the increase in the number of domestic violence cases because of the lockdown situation that happened there, and how instead of just trying to tackle it by speaking to the woman, her organization engaged the men so that they could help to be agents of change in the process. And it had again to do with mindset change too, because this is what they knew, this is what they did, this is how they reacted. And she wanted through her organization to show that it is possible to respond differently. And so engaging the men is really a critical tool in this fight.
Absolutely. And that word critical is just what went through my mind as you started that part of the discussion. It is absolutely critical. It is essential, because it is like the old adage here, one hand can't clap. It takes both men and women to really move the needle forward. And the fact, again, as we said, that there are now organizations that are really dedicated to just that, responding in turn to the needs of men to be involved. And we always say often to men, we have even a program that we did out of a study that we did about early 2001, where we looked at attitudes, but it was the attitude of men in particular. And then we began to include the women in the assessment to see how women played also a role that may not always be the positive role with getting the society as a general to move forward in terms of lowering the temperature and lowering the incidences of violence against women. And we're talking about all forms of violence. And one of the things that came out of our survey was initially that men felt they had a God-given right to do whatever they chose to do with the women, including beating them, putting them down, leaving them to fend for themselves, whatever. And then we decided, okay, how do we respond then, now that we have all of this information? And we created a program called Men Let's Talk. But one of the key things that we also did was, rather than sending the women out, because that too is a part of the problem, when we're in a society where the majority of the households are single-headed households by women, where do men then, especially as growing up boys, where do they get the example? Where do they get the idea that it's not okay? So it takes the men who can influence the other men more so than the women. So when we do these particular programs, we now have, out of that session, we have men who are trained, and they go out as facilitators. We don't even show up many times nowadays because the men can handle it. So they can go out and they take the Men Let's Talk. And they, in fact, have exercises that they do with the men, and then they only need to report back to us where they saw change. And then one of the things that we do in that program, as well as others, is get people to commit to change. You used a term that we use very frequently, which is be an agent of change. That is under our whole moniker. Be that agent of change. So when we even talk to men, just, by accident or incident, as well as when our men facilitators go out, they talk to them in terms of being an agent of change. We have some exercises too that we generally use, like, and I've found out lately a lot of other persons use it, and probably even across the world, where we have role reversal. We'll put the men in the position of women, and if there's women in the group, the women are in the position of men. And then they have to enact certain behaviors for a long time, maybe for half the day. Of course, now with COVID, we haven't been able to have that interface, but we're just waiting to get back to that, because we have found when we do those kind of reverse role play, that it really sinks in a way that ordinarily, and the men will usually say, I just never looked at it in this way. So,
Excellent.
and we have, you do it in a fun way, but it sinks in, and
Yeah,
then you bring it to reality. And that is
really
something
powerful.
that if we could only continue to perpetrate that and just bring it out constantly, but again, it is something that it needs to be sustained.
Right.
And it needs to be something that we constantly, until it just becomes embedded in everyone from top to bottom.
Hmm. And sustainability. I mean, you've said that before, and you've brought it again, and it's probably a great way to talk about how you manage to do what you do, because I think, like a lot of nonprofit organizations, um, you really have to be very creative with the resources that you have. I know, for example, that the issue of violence against women and eliminating violence against women has become one of the EU and UN priorities for this decade at least. And they formed the joint Spotlight Initiative, which is
Yes,
being rolled out in select countries, and Jamaica is one of them. And I
yes,
wonder, to what extent, because I think 8 million euros has been committed over a 3-year period to
yes.
move this agenda forward. To what
Hmm.
extent do you see the Spotlight Initiative as a real opportunity for civil society organizations like yourself to finally have the resources that they need to be able to do more sustainable work?
Um, well, I don't know that I have looked at Spotlight in that way in terms of sustainability of the organizations, because I often say to people, put Woman Inc. out of business so that now, and then people say, what? Then you get the funny looks. But I say again, put us out of business. If you only start to change the behavior in such a way that we no longer have to address this as an issue, you will not need a crisis center. You will not need a shelter for women to have to run to with their children in the middle of the night in their bare feet, or if they're in another country, or maybe they've come to Jamaica from another country. If you would just change the behavior, you would put us out of business, so that the sustainability is only necessary as we work towards changing the behaviors again. And in so doing, we need to change many of the laws, because it does also impact on how we respond and how we behave with regard to the law itself. If there is no real repercussion, if there is no real negative aspect to domestic violence, for example, or as it is in Jamaica, where the Domestic Violence Act, which we fought for so many years and got in 1994, it is so broad, that it is, and it is civil. It is not a crime. We say it's a crime, and yes, it is a crime when you have the physical aspects. But what about the mental and the emotional and all of the other components of what we call abuse that permeate the society again? So again, it's all these moving parts. But in terms of sustainability as it is now, and in how it is reflected with Spotlight, I personally had hoped that out of the Spotlight initiative, that we would identify models, and that those particular models could be replicated throughout Jamaica, throughout the region. And perhaps we could, in turn, also pick up on other models from other countries because again, we're living in a very small world, so that the Spotlight Initiative hopefully will bring about sufficient interaction between countries as well as within the country that we can start to promote the models for change. I haven't actually seen it come to that point yet. I'm very actively engaged with the Civil Society Advisory Group in Jamaica, but the fact that it was launched on the 9th of March, and interestingly, the very next day, the Tuesday, which was March 10th, that was the first COVID case that we had.
Right.
And immediately the protocols for COVID kicked in within a matter of weeks, including basically the shutdown of the country for quite a while. The cruise ships were stopped quite quickly. And by, I think, maybe the first or second week of May, all the airlines were stopped. So that in and of itself, the dynamics of COVID and the COVID protocols is still something very much with us. And even though we've had the little spots with Spotlight Initiative, in my mind, we need to start stepping it up. We need to start stepping it up and really looking for the models that can be replicated throughout the region again, and in particular in the region, because Jamaica at one time was really the model for everyone. Even if I go back to Beijing 95, it was Jamaica that everyone else in the region looked at to take the lead, and we did take the lead. But that lead has diminished, and the whole aspect of the movement itself has diminished. And again, competing priorities, perhaps even the fact that more women are in the workplace. And we have so many other aspects of what we would consider to be the livelihood of persons that's at work that people struggle for. And now again with COVID, we're just not able to see where Spotlight is going to take us. There is room for a lot of work, but we haven't yet caught it on the way I think it should.
Okay. And Joyce, we just have a few minutes, and I just wanted to ask you, you've talked about how it was. You mentioned Beijing, and I know for a lot of people who are following this is so, we're talking about the international conference of conferences that essentially in which the Beijing Declaration was formulated, and that is sort of the governing document concerning women's rights, the advancement of women. In fact, last year with COVID, we should have celebrated, I think, 25 years of meeting. But we have a few minutes, and I want to ask you what would you say to young and upcoming activists who feel like this is just too much work, it's a lot of trouble. You've been doing it for over 2 decades, and still so much needs to be done. What would you say to them? What would be your sort of top 3 recommendations? And I think you have about 3 minutes in which to do it.
Okay, I would say to every young person out there to do as I do, to look at it as something that is a contribution to society. Many times we can make a difference, and it may not be that it is for us. It may be for the generations that are to come. And it is important that we leave something as a legacy, so that if we can leave something behind that says to the youth of today and the youth of tomorrow, that it can be better. But it is a matter of recognizing that everyone has a role to play. Everyone has a role to play. And that means the young persons, just be able to give of your time. I was very pleased the other day when a young woman who just finished her degree said she didn't have any work and she wanted to volunteer. Be ready to volunteer, even if it's only an hour out of a week. Be ready to do that. Many times you will find that the blessings will come to you in other ways, even though you don't do it for the blessings, but get the gratification of helping others. That is what I think being human is all about. If we can't reach out to others and in some way make life better for those around us and behind us, then we have to question our own self worth in terms of our own existence. So I would encourage each and every young person get involved, and necessarily not necessarily even to say that you have to be working at a level that makes you depressed. For example, I had one young person say to me, "It's too depressing. I don't want to think about that." But you can do many, look at public education, public relations, there's fundraising. You can do so many things that may be a part of your tenure, and you don't have to be embroiled in the process of helping someone who is in distress. Because let's face it, not all of us are at that level, but each and every one of us has something to contribute.